Hello, Dog Nation. I am Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. We are so happy to have you with us, and as you might imagine, continuing to follow the aftermath of five-star quarterback Dylan Raiola's commitment to Georgia earlier this week. Praise coming in from national voices, impact on recruiting. We're going to discuss all of that on the program today, and our buddy Mike Griffith is going to stop by. He is going to help us do that there as well. And in addition to that, kind of away from the Raiola topic for a moment, there is one, I think, sort of duty that Georgia fans have this year. One job I believe that Georgia fans have to make sure they do when they watch their team play this season. We'll talk about what that is here coming up just a little bit. It's going to be a fun show, y'all. We're in kind of the midst of a fun season. We love the summer anyway, and summers like this are just a blast because there's so much good news happening around Georgia, including a massive recruiting weekend on tap coming up in just a couple of days. So we're going to cover all of that for you today. So happy to have you with us here for it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I was thinking this morning a little bit, why is it that the commitment of the nation's number one prospect, five-star quarterback Dylan Raiola, why does it feel so big? Now, the credentials alone are enough to make it feel obviously very big, but here's the other thing we kind of know here, which is that Georgia wins big recruiting battles all the time. Georgia is no stranger to having elite recruiting classes. That's the kind of the hallmark of the Kirby Smart program since he's been here. This is a program that kind of brings in the big recruits. And so in one respect, the Raiola thing is obviously not that different than some of the stuff that Georgia's done in the past here. And yet the feeling around Raiola is a good bit different, even than the elite great prospects that Georgia's been collecting year after year after year. So why is that the case? I think a lot of this kind of centers around the fact that it is the quarterback position. Here's the thing, a lot of the people who watch or listen to our show are kind of like me. You're Georgia recruiting obsessive. So you're following every twist and turn, every move that gets made in any given recruiting class in any given year, and your antenna is kind of already up this time of year as it relates to UGA recruiting no matter what. That's just what we do. That's our hobby. That's our pastime. That's what we enjoy doing. But there's another category of Georgia fans, and they're busy. They got families. They got work. They got whatever else. Maybe they haven't been following recruiting for a number of years. And so their relationship with recruiting is a good bit different. They kind of check in, they kind of check out. They're a little bit more casual in terms of their observance of UGA recruiting. They just sort of trust Kirby to go out and get the best players that he can get. They assume he's going to do that. Once those guys get on campus, then they'll take some time to learn who those players are. I would say that group of fans is smaller than it used to be because I think recruiting by and large has kind of gone more mainstream. But nonetheless, there are some casual fans who are kind of only paying attention to this story right now because it is the quarterback spot. And that quarterback, that nation's number one recruit, this sort of brings people into the tent of following UGA recruiting that might otherwise not be following it. And so why does it feel like this story just keeps getting bigger and keeps getting bigger? Because more and more people who don't always follow Georgia recruiting, more and more people who, kind of don't have that necessarily on their radar, well, all of a sudden they are zoomed in very closely. They are paying, very close attention. This story does feel big to them because it is the quarterback. And so those of us are kind of always here. It's kind of like when you know about the cool band and then the cool band goes mainstream and you sort of feel like, well, I knew about him first or something like that. I saw him playing in some, dingy basement somewhere a long time ago. A lot of UGA recruiting fans have a chance to sort of have that feeling a little bit right now of, hey, I've been following Georgia recruiting, and now even more people kind of care about what I care about. More people are kind of coming to the tent. They've heard the same kind of thing, and those of us are sort of always here no matter what. We enjoy the buzz as it builds, and I truly believe that the buzz around five-star quarterback Dylan Raiola is literally just getting started. And part of the enjoyment for Georgia fans around something like this is to sort of listen to what other people are saying about this. I told you a couple of times this week, I think the word that I would use to describe the reaction that Georgia rivals, Florida, Auburn, Tennessee, have had, competitors to the college football playoff for Georgia, like Alabama, Ohio State, the word here is demoralizing. Because what Georgia has shown you, they're more than capable of winning a national championship with a walk-on quarterback. That when you pair walk-on quarterback with best offensive line in the country, best defense in the country, toughest, most willing to embrace the required physicality, no one doing that better than Georgia, that if you've got all that, well, you can have a walk-on quarterback and go out there and, dominate college football. But now Georgia has potentially in its future a quarterback that's the same caliber of every other position group. And wide receivers want to play with that quarterback to give that position group the same cachet, the same stature of the other position groups around the program. And if you're Alabama and Ohio State, you sort of hung your hat on, well, Georgia may have this, and they may have that, and they may have that, but we got the better quarterback play. Well, that's been true, but it may not be true going forward. And, the haters of Georgia in the SEC, the Florida fans, the Auburn fans, the Tennessee fans, the whatever else, the amount of stuff they can even poke at Georgia about, that list of things getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. One of the last things they had was, yeah, but your quarterback play and Kirby's stubborn or whatever else the people say. Well, guess what? All of a sudden now you don't even have that as a talking point anymore when you think about a guy like Dylan Raiola coming into this program, that it really is demoralizing for anybody who kind of would like to think of themselves as either a Georgia rival or a competitor with Georgia. This is just a really, really significant blow to whatever hopes you might have had for college football in the future. And you better believe national media types are going to notice this. I saw where Greg McElroy, ESPN analyst, was doing his podcast thing, and the subject of Dylan Raiola came up. And there's always kind of an interesting thing, as I told you before. Quarterbacks bring casual fans into the recruiting conversation. Most national media types, I would say, are pretty casual when it comes to, their knowledge of recruiting, their ability to talk about recruiting. McElroy, I'd kind of put in that camp. I don't know that I think of him as a recruiting expert. He's obviously an ESPN analyst, but even he was talking about Dylan Raiola this week. And one of the things that he said about, Georgia getting Raiola is an example of the rich getting richer. We would obviously say that, and that's kind of one of the things that makes it so demoralizing for those that are not Georgia. But he then went on to talk about the value of Raiola with the Georgia program as a pretty strong retort to some of the other things that have been going on out there as of late. And this is how the national media sort of perceives the arrival of Raiola into this 2024 class, his presence here now as a magnet drawing others to the Georgia program. Here is how Greg McElroy recently summed that up on an ESPN podcast. Take a listen.
This is really significant because it felt like, at least for the moment, that Georgia was losing a couple key pieces. I already referenced Thomas has flipped to Florida State. They lost Bear Alexander, who was a young player that was likely to become a contributor this season. And people are starting to wonder, hey, where's this going? Mike Bobo's coming in. Just there were some question marks about all of that. Well, Dylan Raiola clearly affirmed that this is significant, that this is still a destination. And I would imagine now, as the top quarterback's made his decision, other players will flock to play with Raiola here in the future.
So McElroy being a good quarterback had a hard count, sort of drew me off sides there. I thought he was done. I jumped back in, and he kept right on going. But obviously the thing that McElroy says there at the end is what's going to be of interest to a lot of Georgia fans, which is the fact that Dylan Raiola is now going to draw more people with him to Georgia. More on that in a moment. But prior to that, the first part of the clip there from McElroy, and I think it's very interesting, from people who kind of only follow recruiting from sort of an arm's length distance and kind of only view Georgia from sort of the 10,000-foot perspective. I guess there'd been some reason for some negativity here as of late. Landon Thomas, did flip to Florida State. Bear Alexander did go to USC. I think those of us who are a little closer to this situation would say, I'm actually not quite so sure Landon Thomas, that story's done. I think we've seen some evidence here that Todd Hartley does not take, a recruiting losses lightly. I don't think that Todd Hartley's given up on Landon Thomas, and I think that the arrival of Raiola gives Thomas a lot more to think about here. So I don't believe by any stretch of the imagination Georgia's waved the white flag on the Landon Thomas situation here, but nonetheless, from sort of the 10,000-foot view, that looked like a recruiting loss to guys like Greg McElroy. You mentioned the Bear Alexander thing. Negative spin. Georgia lost one of its, up-and-coming young defensive linemen. Probably fair to point out that, if Georgia wanted to spend big to hold on to Bear Alexander, it probably could have. The fact that it didn't, I think, would lead you to believe that Georgia feels like it's probably okay without him. That's just sort of a knee-jerk reaction, kind of a quick read there on that situation. No disparaging to Bear, but I think that Georgia still feels like it's probably okay from a defensive line standpoint. But nonetheless, from a guy like McElroy's perspective, sitting there at ESPN, they look at the Dylan Raiola news as, we thought maybe Georgia's had a little bit of a rough offseason, lost a top player to a transfer portal, lost a top recruit to Florida State, and all of a sudden, boom, big response, big, change in the narrative by Kirby Smart here to go out and get Dylan Raiola and to remind people that the Dogs, who've been on top the last couple of years, have every plan to sort of stay there moving forward. That's the kind of praise a guy like Greg McElroy heaps on Georgia after this happens, and I think that Georgia fans kind of enjoy hearing that. The other thing that Georgia fans kind of enjoy hearing is, well, who's next? If Raiola's coming, who's he bringing with him? And to that, I'll invite you to read a great story that Jeff Sentell has right now at DawgNation.com. In fact, let me show you this on the screen here for those of you watching on video. A good tease to this. Jeff writing on Twitter a moment ago, this is just before our show started, that Georgia's going to host its annual Scavenger Hunt this weekend. A lot of you are familiar with that recruiting event where they kind of bring in, they sort of play the Find Kirby Smart game. And it's just kind of one of those fun things they do to kind of get recruits sort of activated on campus, learning more about the scene there at UGA. Jeff writing on Twitter that the novel concept draws a robust list of top prospects. This year sets up as the granddaddy of them all. No disrespect to the Rose Bowl there on that. With the Dogs welcoming several 5 stars, including 5 official visitors. Now, my guess is Jeff will be talking a lot more about this on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger tonight. But if you go to DawgNation.com, obviously you can see the list of official visitors highlighted by Jeremiah Smith, the 5-star wide receiver. And, speaking of competitors with Georgia for the college football playoff, you think Ohio State hates Georgia right now? You better believe they do, starting with Damon Wilson, continuing with the Peach Bowl this past season. Now Dylan Raiola. Now Raiola holding sway over, and you can take that down now, holding sway over Jeremiah Smith. You better believe that the Buckeyes fans have every reason to hate Georgia here at the moment. And Jeremiah Smith's official visit this weekend will be watched closely, not just by Georgia fans, but by Ohio State fans there as well. This is potentially a very big deal. You got Casey Poe taking an official visit out of Tyler, Texas. He's going to be here. Cam McKell, that's a guy we're hearing more about lately out of Statesboro. That's a fun official visit. Marcus Harrison, Colton Heinrich taking official visits there as well. You got a lot of folks coming into Athens here this weekend. You've got an incredible crop of 2025 guys planning to be on hand there as well. So it is starting to happen. The reverberations, the movement that we expected after the Dylan Raiola commitment, already seeing some evidence of that even this upcoming weekend. Jeff Sentell's got all that covered for you there at DawgNation.com. This is so true. Even guys like Greg McElroy that don't necessarily cover recruiting on a regular basis, they're even noticing it too. That the rich get richer. Georgia brings in Raiola. Raiola almost certainly to bring in some folks with him. And what Georgia has been best in college football, with Raiola in the fold, all of a sudden now you get the sense the arrow may still be pointing up going forward. It is undoubtedly a tremendous time to be a Georgia Bulldogs fan. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. Happy to have you with us, no matter how you get to us live on video. We start at 9:45, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app. That's extra content you don't get anywhere else. Special thank you for those of us who watch the show on our own platform. We give you a little extra content just to say thanks for that. We appreciate so many of you being a part of it, thousands of you each and every day on that platform alone. Of course, after that, 10 a.m., we're live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch, all those video platforms there too. That is always a lot of fun. Radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and as a podcast, Apple, Spotify. Some of you listen directly on SoundCloud. Some of you wait for us to post the show at DawgNation.com. It is the platform where all of this began, and if I have to be honest, it's the one that kind of still is special to me in a way that almost nothing else ever could be. Love our podcast listeners, and so happy to have all of you as a part of our program. Also, so thankful to have our friends at Breda Pest Management as a part of all this today, too. And what I love about our great sponsor, and I said this the other day, I can guarantee you right now, Matt Breda has been high-fiving people all over the place ever since Georgia won the commitment of Dylan Raiola. We love great sponsors, but the sponsors that we have that love UGA, that love interacting with Georgia fans, that's just my favorite thing in the world, and that's why I love Breda Pest Management. In fact, Matt's not just a fan. He owns the pest company that gets to call itself the official pest control provider of UGA Athletics. Can you imagine what a prestigious designation that must be within that particular field? And you don't get there without a long track record of quality service for folks for a very long time. And obviously, Breda Pest Management has been in business since 1975. So they've been taking care of folks since longer than I've been born. 125 different employees out there working hard, taking care of folks, really taking just as good a care of your home or your commercial property, whatever you have, as they do of all those UGA athletic facilities, which they're protecting from termites and bugs and critters and everything else. That is what Breda Pest Management does. That is what they are all about. Now, here is where that strength, that prestige, that level of respect works to your benefit, because all of that becomes a resource that can be marshaled in favor for you when you make the switch to Breda Pest Management, because the company you're working with, maybe it's fly by night, maybe it's somebody recommended to you by your uncle or whatever else, and you're just not that happy with it. It's like the quality of service seems to go down, the cost of service seems to go up, everything seems to be getting more expensive these days. But that's not going to be true for Breda Pest Management. When you make the switch to Breda, you're going to put more money in your pocket, boom, right away, just for making that decision. So don't put it off. Make the decision today. In fact, find out more about them. It's BredaPest.com, B-R-E-D-A. BredaPest.com, B-R-E-D-A. You can reach out. Nice, friendly folks, great company, big UGA fans, big supporter of just sort of local sports in general, and great people who want to put more money back in your pocket to give you a great reward incentive for reaching out to them. So make sure you check them out, BredaPest.com, B-R-E-D-A, BredaPest.com, for a lot more on that. All right, we are going to talk to Mike Griffith here in a moment. We'll get some thoughts from Mike about the Dylan Raiola situation that is playing out here right now. Also, before we're done today, there is a word of caution that I've given now a couple of times for a guy that I think that Georgia fans truly love. And today we have more evidence of why that word of caution is appropriate. I'll give that to you here coming up in just a couple of minutes. Prior to that, though, I'm going to go around the Dawghouse. And I want to step away from the Raiola conversation here for a moment, because I think there is a job that Georgia fans have this season. You have a duty this year. You may see your team go for 3 in 23, and obviously we look forward to kind of starting that campaign up here really soon, getting fired up and getting ready to see this Georgia Bulldogs program potentially take home a 3rd straight national championship. However, there is a weird dynamic that occurs with Georgia being as successful as it's been and the number of talented players that create that level of success. And it's not a bad thing, and I believe it's a good thing, but it's a good thing that creates kind of an interesting dilemma for, I think, some Georgia fans sometime. Georgia's had, 8 first-round picks over the course of the last couple of years? Like, how many players has Georgia had over the last 2 national championship seasons that you would say kind of rise the level of being sort of beloved, historic figures for Georgia? I'm not going to run through the entire list, but if we did, boy, it's this guy, it's that guy, it's that guy, and that's that guy. It's just a very, very long list of great players who've been at Georgia the last couple of seasons. That's a great thing if you're a Georgia fan. It truly is. But an ensemble cast like that sometimes means that certain people don't get the attention that they probably should. Certain players probably don't get the love they should probably get. And I think that Georgia's actually got a lot of what I would call underrated players from time to time, certainly national media-wise. I believe there are a great number of underrated players. I think Smile Mondon probably was one of those guys last year. It's laughable that Georgia hasn't won the Joe Moore Award either of the last 2 years. That's an example of Georgia being somewhat underrated. But believe it or not, I think it's even possible that Georgia's best overall player is himself also underrated. Let's talk about Brock Bowers here for a moment. This is the job, this is the duty that I believe that Georgia fans have this year. You got to appreciate this. While it's happening, while it's going on, you got to appreciate this. Now, the other day, you can go back to February for a moment. We were doing some vacation shows back in February, and we kind of did our Mount Rushmore of Georgia football, the 4 most significant players, the best players this program's ever had. And I had Bowers on my list of the 4 best players that ever played for this program, even coming to this season. I believe I'm right for doing so. But with a 3rd year coming up, and we believe it'll probably be Bowers last year, with a 3rd year coming up, he has a chance to sort of add to that legacy even more. And I believe that he probably will. I think he's going to be a 1,000-yard receiver this year. That's something only one other Georgia player has ever done. Our buddy Terrence Edwards will join us tomorrow. That's kind of the job right now for Georgia fans to realize that you're seeing something special. And what Bowers is transcends the tight end position. I believe in a lot of respects he's redefined the tight end position, certainly here at Georgia and across college football. But the level of success that he's enjoying transcends that position. Who would you trade Brock Bowers for in this country right now? I hope you say nobody. I really do. Not Marvin Harrison Jr., not Caleb Williams, not anybody. I wouldn't trade Brock Bowers for anybody, and nor do I think that you should either. He is just that kind of player. And the other day, when Kirby's on the WJOX radio interview, he was kind of interacting with Cole Kubelik about this, about just how good Brock Bowers can be. And they were kind of joking about the fact that he's done some running back practice, and he could probably play any number of positions. And in light of what I was just saying, Kirby talking about Bowers and also the tight end position in general, probably pretty relevant here. But Georgia fans got to appreciate just how special Brock Bowers is. Here is Kirby talking about Bowers and the rest of that position group here on WJOX just last week.
How much more can we see from Brock Bowers this year? Like how many more different things can he do for your football team?
As many times as he can touch the ball, he needs to touch it. He is a special football player.
Play him on defense.
Hey, I could do it, man. He could play it. I guarantee you that.
Well, when I talked to him before I had you guys this year, he said, I have lined up at tailback.
Yeah, he worked at tailback because we didn't have any backs, and we took about a week-long camp deal and worked him at tailback in case we needed him.
The guy's ridiculous.
He's a good player, man.
Insane. You're loaded at tight end again. You have to feel good about that spot.
Well, we're not as loaded as we were. We don't have a guy like Darnell. We've got.
Has there ever been a guy like Darnell at tight end before?
But we don't have him. So we had him. We don't have him. So it's not the exact same.
So one of the things that Kirby Smart says there is, hey, as many different ways as he can touch it, he needs to. And we've seen Bowers carry the ball. We haven't seen him line up at tailback during a game. We've seen him carry the ball against the little sort of jet sweep carries, things like that. He has done, plenty of that. And Kirby says, hey, we need to get him as many touches as we can. Now, during the regular season last year, that's not something that Georgia always did. They were trying to get other guys involved, and they sort of knew the Bowers button. They sort of could push that, the easy button, if you will, anytime they wanted to, but they were kind of content in most games because they're blowing teams out, not necessarily do that. Well, national championship game, all of a sudden there was no reason to save anything anymore. It was literally your last game. So they just turned Bowers loose, and what do you have, darn near 200 yards receiving? You kind of wonder if this year, in what's going to be their final year to use Bowers, if they just sort of feel like this year they get the freedom to kind of push the envelope with him more, and we do see him more of a sort of a featured player, focal point of the offense in a way that last year wasn't often that. I hope that's the case because I do think it makes it easier for Georgia fans to do what I requested of them a moment ago, which is just appreciate what you got in this guy. As good a player as Georgia's probably ever had come through this program. Certainly on that shortest list of very best players the program's ever had, I believe that is what Brock Bowers is. Now, very quickly on a slightly different subject, I do think as we head through the summer, towards the start of the season, we are also going to talk more about what Kirby says there, that the loss of Darnell Washington is a significant one, right? Because, Darnell was just such a big weapon, literally and figuratively, opposite Brock Bowers a year ago. How you replace him matters. And in some respects, we've talked during the spring about the fact that, well, maybe Georgia kind of looks to look a little different on offense this year, where you may see only one tight end in the game more frequently, 3 wide receiver sets, just because that Darnell Washington isn't here. That may be true no matter what, just because of how good we think the Dominic Lovett might be as a slot receiver. That might sort of predicate more 3 wide receiver sets. But also I think that Georgia, despite the fact that we would all take what Kirby says there about Darnell very, very seriously, I think that Georgia actually still sets up pretty well at the tight end position overall. I think that Oscar Delp ought to be on your list of players who could really be breakout candidates here this year. And everything we heard about Lawson Lucky in the spring would suggest that he's a guy that's going to need to be on the field in some form or fashion at times this year there as well. So take Kirby seriously. There is no Darnell Washington, and Darnell Washington was such a catalyst and an engine that made the Georgia offense go a year ago. But nonetheless, the premise of the question I think is still correct, that Georgia still sets up to be very deep at tight end opposite Brock Bowers. But all of that shouldn't take the spotlight off of Bowers either. This is a truly special player, and this is the kind of guy that could be best player in the entire country regardless of position. So as you get ready to settle in and hopefully see Georgia go for 3 in 23, how they do it's going to matter. Showcasing Brock Bowers and his prodigious skill set, seeing more of that for probably the final time here in Athens here this year. An important job for Georgia fans to sit back, notice that, and really soak all that in and appreciate it for exactly what has been one of the best careers that anybody's ever put together at the University of Georgia. That is Around the Dawghouse here today. As I told you before, I'm going to talk to you a little bit later on about a figure that Georgia fans love that probably needs a very good year this year and kind of what that means for the rest of the SEC. We'll do all that coming up here in just a moment. But for now, let's get back to the conversation that's dominated the week. Nation's #1 recruit, 5-star quarterback Dylan Raiola on his way to the University of Georgia. What does this mean for the Dogs? Let's find out from Mike Griffith here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Great to have Mike Griffith here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management today. Mike, we've obviously tried to cover the Raiola news from every single angle, but I haven't personally heard from you on this yet. So let you have the floor here. What does the Raiola news mean for you?
Well, it's momentum. It's validation of the Mike Bobo hire and of Kirby Smart and the confidence the elite players have in the program. I feel like it's redemption after a much publicized loss out on Arch Manning last year. And you come back and get the number one overall player. I mean, if you get Arch Manning last year, you don't get Raiola this year. I can tell you that. So, in hindsight, the timing's better. When we look at the quarterback room and the confidence that we have that Carson Beck or Brock Vandegrift will be able to take the reins and have success this year and into next year. Because I think with Raiola, we're probably looking at 2025 for a major impact, although I don't completely rule out him competing in 2024. I think that Gunnar Stockton is probably the guy on the hot seat, if anybody. But we've seen less heralded guys win the job before. I think the guy that just walked out the door was a junior college walk-on that no other Power 5 school wanted out of high school or out of the portal out of Georgia Junior College. So it just goes to show you that. It doesn't matter what your rankings are, it's what you do when you get here. But nonetheless, from a surface point of view, and the national reaction is, wow, Georgia really has it going, and that's really good momentum. That's a good advertisement for the program.
So let's work through this for a moment, because I think you bring up an interesting point. I'm going to kind of do this off the top of my head, and if I'm forgetting something big, please, there are probably even other examples I could give you where, if you want to go like early era college football playoff, there were a lot of freshman quarterbacks starting and really doing pretty well as true freshmen. It sort of seems like to me, Mike, the last couple of years, we've trended away from that a little bit. I guess Caleb Williams eventually became a true freshman starter for Oklahoma, but that took a while for that to take place. Bryce Young did not start his first year at Alabama. C.J. Stroud didn't start his first year at Ohio State. It sort of seems like right now we're kind of in a sort of a micro era of kind of trending away from the true freshman starter, whereas if you want to go, a handful of years ago, there were true freshman quarterbacks starting for programs all over, college football, and some of them were the very best programs. Is that kind of your read on the situation too, that, it wasn't that long ago that we had true freshman starters in college football? Seems like we haven't done that around the sport quite as much as of late, unless they're obviously big names I might be forgetting.
Well, I think the transfer portal has a lot to do with that, Brandon. Teams can go to the portal now and get answers, whereas maybe before, they had their freshmen coming in, or the guy ahead of them got injured, was the case with Eason and Fromm. I don't think Jake would have started if Eason hadn't gotten injured. I think, Jake was pressed into playing, and it just so happened that was a run-dominant team. When you looked at the personnel, it was what was dictated. It wouldn't matter who the starter was. I mean, if you got Sony Michel and Nick Chubb, you're going to run the football a lot, and Georgia did more than any other school outside of the academies that year. They had a higher run to pass ratio because of the talent that they had. But I think the portal probably has something to do with that, as teams are able to now address their needs through the portal. Transfers, there's been a little bit more of a proliferation of transfers, probably going back to 2019, 2020. I think the system that you play has something to do with that, and Georgia, very comfortable in a pro-style system now, and for people that don't know, that puts a lot of power and control. And I mean, my goodness, you saw Gunnar Stockton, struggling to get a playoff in the G-Day game, and taking a delayed game inside the 5-yard line. I mean, this is a really smart, really good quarterback, going into his second year that's having trouble getting a snap off on time because there's that much to do. So Georgia's system is such that it's very challenging for incoming players. And I mean, we saw it with Justin Fields. You see it with Gunnar Stockton. You'll see it with you'll probably see it with the next guy. So I think it's a combination of things. I think one, it's the transfer portal, which is helping teams meet their needs through other means. And two, in Georgia's case, I think it's the complexity of the offense and everything that they ask that quarterback to do, between calling 2 or 3 plays in the huddle, to picking the right play, to setting the protections, to setting the run leverages, to making route and receiver adjustments, and doing all that in a 15-second window, leaving the huddle.
The other thing that you just have to, I think, give credit for here is, as you mentioned, the Mike Bobo part of this. That when Bobo was here the first go around, he was one of the best recruiters Georgia had on its coaching roster, regardless of position. And you don't oftentimes think of the offensive coordinators necessarily being your alpha recruiter, but Bobo was a major influence on a lot of guys that didn't even play on offense. You want to go back to his previous time being here, and this is the kind of recruiting win I think you're capable of having when you've got a guy like Bobo that prioritizes recruiting. And listen, everybody can say what you want about Todd Monken as a play caller on the field. Obviously, he was fantastic. The results speak for itself. But also, I think Monken, by his own admission, was just not that into the recruiting part of this. And so I think stories like this kind of give you an indication of the sort of value add that a guy like Mike Bobo can provide as offensive coordinator, because he is just sort of better at genuinely fostering those relationships in a way that a lot of offensive coordinators might not be, including his predecessor there at UGA.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that I think we really have to take a hard look at is Todd Monken. That his play calling at Kentucky didn't look good. And they scored 17 points and they ran at 16 on it. His play calling for three quarters against Oklahoma. There were games, Clemson, he was completely outcoached. There were plenty of games where Todd Monken's play calling wasn't great, and the Georgia's prolific defense saved the day and gave him until the fourth quarter to get something going. So you take Georgia away from Todd Monken and you stack his resume up against Mike Bobo's, and I would tell you that Mike Bobo's numbers were every bit as good, especially when you look at some of the records that Mike Bobo set at Georgia. 2014, the highest scoring Georgia team ever, Aaron Murray, all-time league passer, David Green, SEC winning as quarterback. Mike Bobo has a great resume. What he didn't have was a great defense to work with. Mike Bobo is, from all the folks that I've talked to that played for him, Brandon, he's the offensive version of Kirby when it comes to the enthusiasm, when it comes to the locker room talk. I mean, there's a lot of fire. If we play the what-if game and Kirby Smart's an assistant on Mark Richt's staff and Mike Bobo's on the Nick Saban staff, and Kirby Smart tries to coach Colorado State and goes to South Carolina, and Auburn is a coordinator with the talent that they had, and Mike Bobo's here, with the talent that Georgia's had. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is I'm not surprised. I've been more surprised by the failure of some fans to recognize that Mike Bobo is a really good coach and had really good success here, but he did not have the prolific defenses to cover up for him like some of the times Georgia sputtered these last 2 years. He didn't have that. And so what's fascinating to me about where we're at is, we have the Mark Richt offense, essentially. I think Del McGee's the only assistant that wasn't under Mark Richt. And, oh, by the way, Kirby Smart was once a Mark Richt offensive assistant, which was just an incredible note. And you have the Kirby Smart defense. It's kind of the best of both worlds. So, people like Matthew Stafford, also coached by Mike Bobo, Super Bowl champion, can recognize these things, right? But fans that hang out on Twitter and grab at low-hanging fruit and just kind of repeat things over and over without really thinking about it fail to recognize how accomplished Mike Bobo was at Georgia when he had talent to work with. And he's got talent to work with, and I'm expecting offensive fireworks this year.
Sounds like you got a little bit of a heart out here, so I want to squeeze in one more topic before we let you go. That's some of the news from last week, away from the Dylan Raiola thing here a little bit, about the future of the Georgia-Florida series in Jacksonville. We know that there's some stadium renovations coming up, and I guess, Mike, my big takeaway on this over the course of the last few days is that there might actually be a little bit more life left in the cocktail party than I realized. At the very least, it sort of seems like 2023 won't be the last cocktail party. I'm guessing that the option year is going to be picked up here prior to June 30th. I get the sense of that at least. And maybe the game in Jacksonville lives on beyond that there as well. That's not what I expected to be true, but I sort of think there may be a little bit more life left in the cocktail party than I realized. What's your read on the situation?
Yeah, I think you're right. I remember you telling me that if Kirby Smart won a national championship, he could do whatever he wanted to do with the game in Jacksonville. And a lot of people said that. And now that he's won it, people are saying, well, see, he doesn't really have to move it after all. So it's kind of interesting, to see the university go against Kirby. But that's what it feels like. It feels like that there will be an extension. The money is whatever needed, wanted, the extra $2 or $3 million. You and I know it's bigger than that. There's obviously some politics behind this. And I give the city of Jacksonville great credit. They've done a tremendous job. I mean, you're a kid from the northeastern Georgia, Brandon, and
Yeah.
you turned out just fine. I mean, you're very accomplished. You met your brother. I mean, you guys are incredibly intellectuals. But
First time anybody's ever said it about my brother, I think.
I like your brother.
No, I'm
your brother. You need to have him on DawgNation Daily. That's a throwdown challenge to you.
There you
I
go.
want Brandon and his brother on there. But
There you go.
But the fact is, the Northeast Florida's got better schools. It's got a better infrastructure. They've got an airport in Gainesville with 8 gates and a brand new Delta terminal. And Athens is struggling. It's struggling in a lot of different ways. And this is a game that, to me, would have a major impact on the local economy, which ultimately would help the school and the people that live here and make the University of Georgia what it is. Now, there was a time when South Georgia was politically more tied to the school than it is now. Obviously, the demographics have shifted in terms of the population base and where students are coming from. And, you and I could do an entire show on this, and maybe one day we will. But for right now, at least, I tip my cap to the city of Jacksonville and the Florida fans. The Gators are on life support right now. They need this game there another 2 years. I don't know that Billy Napier is the answer, but they need this money in their economy and this excitement. And I give all the credit to Florida and Jacksonville. They're doing a tremendous job protecting something that means a lot to that northeastern Florida economy.
All right, Mike, thanks for being here today. We'll look forward to bringing a bunch more from you there at DawgNation.com. And I'll talk to you back here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management again very soon there as well.
I appreciate it, Brandon. Have a good one.
Yes, sir.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
All right, 2 quick things here. First of all, Mike always says that I once said that if Kirby Smart won the national championship, he could do whatever he wanted with the cocktail party. I think, and you can go back and check the tapes on this, if assuming you could find this is years and years ago. I think what I actually said is I don't want to hear about canceling the cocktail party until you have won a national championship. Well, now Smart's won 2. So clearly his leverage is as high as it ever is. But I think one of the things that I've learned throughout this process, and listen, I don't mind telling you, if I have a big-time bias, I don't mind putting it out there. And you can judge for yourself if the words that I'm using are, valid to you based on the bias you understand me to have. I am pro-cocktail party. I like the cocktail party. I'd like to see it stay. I have thought it was going to come to an end, and now I'm not quite so sure. So know my bias coming into the discussion, and you can judge everything else based on the bias that I'm more than happy to acknowledge and represent to you here on this. But the point is that what I have learned is, even with Kirby kind of having more sort of political capital at his disposal than he's ever had because of 2 straight national championships, this game is just really, really lucrative. And road games are expensive. I think Chip Towers had this in the AJC the other day, that it costs you about $500,000 to go play a road game in the SEC. It's just expensive. And so when you got the neutral site game, both sides getting their travel costs paid for, they bring in the big bucks. That just ends up being a lot of money. And, like a lot of these sort of like $1 million this, $1 million that, it kind of just sort of goes in one ear and out the other because we're not getting the money anyway, so what do we care? But when you really kind of stop and pause and realize, oh, wow, this is actually a pretty big windfall coming Georgia's way. And listen, there is a growing number of Georgia fans who don't want the game in Jacksonville. I respect your opinion. I even respect the idea that we're getting pretty close to that almost being the majority opinion, and I sort of understand that too. Like, I'm not so wrapped up in my own bias here that I can't show some respect for the fact that you got more and more Georgia fans who seemingly would like to have this game in Athens. I get that, but the reason why your wishes might not be acquiesced to here, why Kirby Smart's wishes might not be acquiesced to here, is because of just how much money this game, kind of brings in to Georgia for traveling down to Jacksonville. And the other thing, and I know this was in the Chip Tower story at AJC the other day, and this to me kind of jumped off the page. And I just thought this was really interesting. So, the current Jaguars owner is Shad Khan. I think he bought the team in 2011, I think. Tony Khan, his son, runs the AEW, but that's a different story for a different day. But Shad Khan owns the Jacksonville Jaguars. And there was a figure within the Jaguars organization that said, we view the Georgia-Florida game completely different than the previous Jaguars ownership did. Listen to this. This is very interesting. By the way, this would be kind of a nice thing for the Falcons to sort of do sometimes, sort of acknowledging the power and the magnitude of the Georgia fan base. The Jacksonville Jaguars, as an organization, believe that the most important event that happens in Jacksonville every year is the Georgia-Florida game. It's not a Jaguars game. And there's a quote from Chip at the AJC the other day from somebody from the Jaguars organization who says that. The most important thing that happens in Jacksonville every year is not a Jaguars game. It's the Georgia-Florida game. So this big new stadium renovation that's going to take place in Jacksonville eventually is apparently going to be done so with Georgia-Florida in mind. And as Chip has reported there, they are going to be consulting with and have already been consulting with Georgia and Florida on this project. So basically, it's like everybody wants to build like the new Battery, where the Braves play there at Truist Park, the Battery around that, the kind of mixed-use development around a stadium. That's everything that exists now. By the way, Arizona Coyotes yesterday voted down a stadium referendum, so keep your eyes on hockey returning to Atlanta here at some point in time, or at least suburban Atlanta at some point in time. Same kind of mixed-use stadium type project, but that's what this is going to be on the river there in Jacksonville. And Georgia and Florida being heavily consulted on this as a way of making this palatable for the needs of the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. So not only is Georgia, Florida maybe alive to remain in Jacksonville here, we could actually have new life breathed into the cocktail party, and all of a sudden you're going to be playing in a facility that's befitting the quality of the game. Because I don't mind telling you, as someone who has loved Georgia, Florida for a long time, that stadium in Jacksonville is a dump. It's just an absolute dump. It's the worst of the worst. And I'll go off on a slight tangent here, and then I promise we'll get the train back on the tracks. So one of the cool things about Georgia is Georgia plays a lot of games in NFL stadiums, and typically speaking, NFL stadiums are really nice, especially from a media standpoint, because you got a lot of good Wi-Fi. Just everything about an NFL stadium is just usually pretty nice. Well, technically speaking, the stadium in Jacksonville, NFL stadium too, it's not like any other stadium I've ever been to in the NFL. I have a hard time imagining there are very many worse stadiums. It may be the absolute last, 32nd out of 32. It may be the worst stadium in the NFL. Well, that's not going to be the case anymore. Coming up pretty soon, there are going to be big-time renovations there, and Georgia, Florida are a major player in those renovations. So you can be for it, you can be against it. I understand there's a pretty big divide among Georgia fans about it, and we've kind of covered that for a good number of years. But interesting twists in all of this here right now, and cocktail party may live a little longer than some of us thought, which I have to admit I do think is probably a good thing. All right. So the music ended a long time ago. So let me just kind of quickly talk about going around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean and being on a Royal Caribbean cruise ship here myself coming up before the summer's done. Looking forward to that. But the other thing that I look forward to is your own opportunity to be on a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. I will tell you, one of the things I still love is the way in which I still hear from so many people that were on the DawgNation cruise with us, people who had a great time and enjoyed themselves. I enjoyed getting to know them. There is just something about the DawgNation cruise where you spend more time, extended time with Georgia fans, and it's a little bit different than one of our meet and greet type things we may do. We're only somewhere for a couple of hours here locally, and we got to move on, go on with our life. I've always sort of viewed the DawgNation cruise as sort of like DawgNation's version of summer camp. You just sort of get to know people a little bit better. And I still hear from folks and hear about the great time they had on board the DawgNation cruise, which I love. And it just really invigorates me to want to tell you that I promise, if you go out there and get your own Royal Caribbean cruise vacation this summer, heading towards, fall 2023, always great deals on those cruise ships come fall time of the year or early 2024, the debut of Icon of the Seas. I truly believe you're going to enjoy it, and you're going to have just as much fun as the hundreds of people who joined us for the recent DawgNation cruise. So give Jessica Slater a call. She's a travel agent. She was selected for us by Royal Caribbean. Royal Caribbean believes that a great Royal Caribbean cruise vacation made even better by a great travel agent. They think Jessica is a great one. She served us very well, including my own family's personal travel, too. So you can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. All right, for today's cruise around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean, I like lists. I like talking season. I like fodder for chatter during talking season. And one of the things that always kind of comes out this time of year is our friends at CBS Sports will rank all of the coaches in the Power 5. They kind of always do it this way, where they'll give you the top 25, but then prior to that, they'll kind of give you the coaches that didn't make the top 25. And sometimes that kind of bottom part of the Power 5 is the most interesting part of this. So for now, I want to highlight the names from the SEC who are kind of viewed to be outside the 25 best coaches in college football as ranked by the, I guess, panel of experts, if you will, there at CBSSports.com. Starting with Zach Arnett from Mississippi State at 68. Now, here's the thing. Anytime they have a coach that hasn't coached before, they always kind of rank them near the bottom of this particular list here. What I think is interesting about Arnett, and this is probably worth paying attention to, even though that Georgia doesn't play Mississippi State this year, is apparently Arnett wants to completely refashion the Mississippi State program. He has selected an offense here that is worlds different than what the Mike Leach offense was. That the old Leach era, and obviously, we continue to be sad about the passing of Mike Leach, but talking about, the football part of this here right now, they want to move off the Mike Leach offensive system. Rylan Godey's been brought there to play tight ends. That program hasn't had tight ends in a good number of years. And so Arnett not only has a pretty tough task of just sort of stepping in the shoes of a very, very recognizable and kind of, cast a large shadow, a guy like Leach, big personality. Arnett's got tough shoes to fill on that, but he's made his task even tougher by the fact that he's sort of reimagining the program here. Now, he's got the multi-year deal. He is not an interim coach. He is the full-fledged coach at Mississippi State, but he probably needs some success here early on, or at least some success, something to sort of hang his hat on to make the sort of Bulldogs faithful there sort of feel okay about that contract. So Arnett trying to make Mississippi State into a little bit different kind of program, that's going to be interesting this year. Let me roll through here. Keep scrolling. You find Clark Lee at 56. Lee actually won 2 SEC games a year ago. He may be a little too low there on that list. And then if you keep scrolling a little bit more, you get to Eli Drinkwitz at 51. I don't have a ton to say about him. He sort of is what he is. But eventually you're going to work your way to Billy Napier at 43. And I don't know that anything says the situation at Florida more so than that right now. That this is a program that's just sort of skating on thin ice right now, and CBS Sports only views them as having the 43rd best coach in the country. Now, there was a time in which Florida aspired for national championships, and now even making a bowl sort of seems like a successful season. That program has fallen off mightily. And you got, Scott Strickland, the athletic director, in the page of The Athletic begging for patience there on that. And I guess Florida fans are going to have no choice but to do it. But it is weird times down in Gainesville right now. But ultimately, the name I really want to get to is Sam Pittman. Sam Pittman on this list, CBSSports.com, and this is just one group of folks who follow college football's opinion. This isn't the end-all, be-all, but I do think it's interesting as sort of a conversation starter of kind of how Pittman's viewed right now. Every Georgia fan that I know, with good reason, loves Sam Pittman. I love Sam Pittman. I've said this before. I have never rooted for another SEC team as openly as I root for Arkansas because I just like Pittman that much. He was a great pivotal figure for the beginning of the Kirby Smart era. I think he's got a tremendous personality. I want more coaches in college football like Sam Pittman. And the early wins that he had during his time there at Arkansas in 2020 and 2021 is great to see. But you sort of see the way in which that's kind of caused Pittman to sort of trend up in the eyes of a lot of folks around college football and now maybe start to trend down. I want to give you an example of this. So when Pittman stepped in the first time there at Arkansas in 2020, he was ranked as the 50th best coach in college football. But after he had some success, he moved all the way up to the 20th best coach in college football. So he actually moved up 30 spots on this list because of the early success that he had there with the Hogs. But now after last year where they were just 7-6, now he's fallen down into the 20 spots. So think about this for Pittman. In the eyes of just a group of folks who rank coaches, Pittman moves up 30 spots, then they start losing games, now he drops 20 spots. And I would say in some form or fashion, that's also kind of the way in which a lot of the perception of Sam Pittman has sort of trended with a lot of other folks in college football there as well. The point is, I don't take any great pleasure in saying this, but it is just the cold, honest truth. Sam Pittman needs to win some games at Arkansas this year. At a certain point in time, your sort of favorite son status and the fact that I don't know anybody who dislikes Pittman, at a certain point in time, you got to be able to give your fans some wins. And some of what has sort of colored the perception of Pittman is in games in which Arkansas hasn't always won, they have oftentimes covered the spread, at least early stages of the Arkansas era with Pittman, that was kind of true. But for Hogs fans, that doesn't mean much. They don't actually get the W. You go and look at some of these, like lost Texas A&M a year ago and, close calls against like Missouri State and people like that. Like Sam Pittman needs a good season there at Arkansas. Now, how do you define good in the final year of the SEC West? That's probably in the eye of the beholder, but probably better than 7-6. Probably needs to be that. We'll see if he's able to. Shane Beamer comes in at number 40 on this list. I think that Tom Fornelli, who writes up, Fornelli's not the only one who kind of casts these votes, but he is the one that sort of writes all this up. I think he makes an interesting statement about Beamer there at CBS coming in number 40. He says, "While I believe the assessment's probably fine," he says, "I'm a little surprised he didn't receive a bigger bump, meaning higher than 40th on the list, better than 40th on the list, based on what South Carolina has done." I will agree with Tom Fornelli on that. I think you got to view Shane Beamer as arguably the most underrated coach in all of college football. When you look at Josh Heupel at Tennessee, Heupel's getting far more credit for his first 2 years at Tennessee than Shane Beamer's getting there at South Carolina, and Shane Beamer beat Josh Heupel just a couple of months ago. So I do believe that Beamer, who has shown year-over-year improvement, 2 pretty good years in the job there at South Carolina, they're recruiting very well right now, have an outside chance to be a top 20 team here this year. I do think that Shane Beamer right now is probably an underrated coach in college football, and is probably doing better at South Carolina than he's, for the most part, getting credit for. And then finally, one more to give you here. Number 26 in this list, and I guess tomorrow or sometime this week, CBS Sports will come out with its top 25, and we'll see if they do rank Kirby Smart number 1, as they should. But before we get to the top 25 later in the week from CBSSports.com, you see number 26 on this list, Auburn coach Hugh Freeze. Y'all, that is something you ought to notice, you ought to pay attention to. Now, Hugh Freeze has been at Liberty the last couple of years, so he hasn't really been on this list. So he's only eligible for this list now because they're ranking Power 5 coaches now. Auburn has a better coach than a lot of other teams in the SEC. This ranking would certainly seem to suggest that's the case. How good can he be at Auburn? The jury is still, of course, out on that. But I believe Auburn made a good hire when it hired Hugh Freeze. And you can say what you want to about his personal life, and you have every right to do that. Freeze has said he's a changed man, and he's better now than he used to be. The proof will soon be in the pudding on that one way or another. But there are a lot of programs right now that look at their coach, and they ought to be wondering, is our guy as set up for success at our place as Hugh Freeze there is at Auburn? And if you're a Billy Napier at Florida, or a Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss, or a so-and-so at so-and-so, Jimbo Fisher, Texas A&M, maybe even, I think the presence of Hugh Freeze there at Auburn might prove to be a little bit of a problem for you, and we'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And the summer is here, and I love this time of year. Love being at the swimming pools, love being on golf courses, love going on lake and fishing or whatever else that you're doing. When you're outside having a good time this time of year, there is no better accompaniment for your enjoyment than our friends at the Finish Long Drink. It's a ready-to-drink cocktail. Comes in a can, so it sort of looks like a beer, but it's not. It's a ready-to-drink cocktail. It's a mixed drink in a can, basically. So if you like mixed drinks, you'll love this. You can pour it into a glass, you can pop the top, and just enjoy it straight out of the can. My wife was saying the other day she would love to have some more long drink cranberry in the house. We get ready to move into this summertime of year, and so that's my marching orders. We'll get that taken care of here very soon. Of course, you can try the Long Drink Strong as well. Long Drink Zero, that's no carbs, no sugar. For those of you who want to look good in your bathing suit. The traditional in the blue can. It's got the gin kick, the grapefruit flavor. Man, it's just good stuff. So many of you have tried it and you've enjoyed it, and you share it with us when you do. Others of you, well, maybe you're still waiting to kind of find out all about it. So go to thelongdrink.com for more on that. That's thelongdrink.com. You can find out where to pick some up, and you can find out where you can enjoy some Finish Long Drink here today. All right, golden shoe time. By the way, speaking of the lousy, stinking Gators, kind of an oldie but a goodie. We've had this a couple times before. Dog fans love sharing this. Our buddy Bill Sanders, the latest to share it with us, and we'll always re-rack this each and every time because I do think it's truly funny. Bill says the evolution of the trash icon. You go back and see this from the old. Is this Microsoft? That's what this is, like Microsoft Windows, I guess. You see how the trash icon has evolved itself. And then finally, 2022, yeah, it's the lousy, stinking Gators logo. Bill, that is very funny, and we love it, and that is our golden shoe winner for today because we truly believe that is what the lousy, stinking Gators are. And listen, cocktail party may live on. Georgia may be in Jacksonville for quite some time. We think it's bad news for Florida wherever the game is played, and 164 days from right now, that will be proven once again. It is our Gator Hater Countdown. Hope all of you have a great day, and we'll see you back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. Talk to you then, everybody. And on video. Time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. Showing up on time. Doing the work that's promised. For the price that's promised. R.S. Andrews can be the one you turn to for all of that. All right, I'm going to get your comments here. Facebook first. I haven't started on Facebook in a little while, so I'll do that here today. and we'll see how folks are doing. By the way, Bill Sanders in our Facebook comment section, getting a chance to take a victory lap on the Golden Shoe win there. Actually, Jacob O'Neill says Bill Sanders is not here today. So he wins the Golden Shoe, but he's not in here to take his bouquets. Let's see what else. Becky Rutledge checking in from Chattanooga. Becky, glad to have you here. Chris James asked a good question. He says, does the new playoff format help or hurt Georgia's chances of winning 3 of the next 5 national championships? So, Chris, here's what I believe. I believe the expanded playoff format for Georgia helps it in a mighty way. And I think the FCS playoff is the best example of this. We've seen the same team, North Dakota State, win, 9 of the last 12, I think it is, 8 of the last 12, 9 of the last 12 FCS championships. That the expanded playoff makes it actually, I think, easier for the best teams. What that means, I think, in plain English for this upcoming year is, if I told you this year, shudder the thought, of course, but if I told you this year Georgia's not going to win the national championship, what is the most likely scenario that would cause Georgia not to win the national championship? I believe the number one thing that would prevent Georgia from winning the national championship is they just don't make the college football playoff. That obviously it would take a loss not to win the national championship. To me, it's far more likely that Georgia loses one of its 12 regular season games, giving the committee an excuse to exclude them from the playoff, more so than it is, hey, they're 13-0, they go to the playoff, and they lose straight up head-to-head to one of those teams there. I mean, we've just seen Georgia show up and play its big games well now for a couple of years. We trust Georgia in a big game environment. But over the course of a long season, anything can happen. Funny thing about math is if you got like a 90% chance of winning every regular season game, that does not mean your chance of winning all those games is 90%. That we see teams lose in the regular season all the time. So if Georgia were to not win the national championship this year, the most likely thing to prevent that, I believe, would be some sort of regular season loss that caused them not to make the college football playoff. So in the future, all of a sudden, that's not quite so much an issue anymore. If you have the one bad game at some point in time, if you're not the SEC champion, if you're not obviously one of the 4 best teams, well, I mean, how many years in the future would you have to go to assume that Georgia wouldn't still be one of the 12 best teams? And all of a sudden, now you're in the college football playoff, and a team like Georgia in a head-to-head situation in kind of, an elite big game scenario, it just becomes very tough to beat. So moving forward, I believe the expanded playoff works to Georgia's benefit. Now, I also think it works to the benefit of Ohio State and Alabama and those teams that we sort of think of as the top tier in college football, but Georgia's clearly in that group. So I believe after this year, Georgia's chances of winning a national championship go up, not down, because of the expanded playoff. Now, I think the schedule that Georgia plays on a yearly basis probably gets a little bit more difficult, but I don't necessarily think that's a problem. So I think it's a really good question, and I think the answer is emphatically that the expanded playoff will help Georgia, I believe. Let's see what else. Let's see what else on Facebook here. Let's see what else is going on the Facebook side of things. Some of y'all enjoying kind of chatting back and forth with each other. I think Jason Neely was talking about bringing in a new center next year, 2024. Yeah, obviously, at some point in time, you're going to say goodbye to guys like SVP, and that's never a fun thing. Miriam Corbin, though, looking forward to a 2023 season, which maybe Georgia's so good that it's blowing teams out, creating opportunities, for more reserve players to get a chance to play, and that's obviously one of those things that you're hopeful that Georgia's able to do, which is establish that depth to kind of move forward. Matt Rugavina says, if Kirby was willing to skip a White House visit because of a summer schedule, I'm willing to bet he'll leave Jacksonville that extra home game. I just think this is one of those things that, Kirby's obviously a very loud voice on this, but this is not one of those things that he has full control over. I mean, the classic example of this is all those non-conference games that Georgia scheduled years ago, and one of those games, the Oklahoma game for this year, is not being played. That you can say this should be this way, or you can maybe say it's fine the way that it is. But Kirby does not have total autonomy in all of this. The SEC stepped in and told Georgia this year, you're not playing Georgia, Oklahoma, and there was really nothing that Kirby Smart could do about it. If certain powers that be step in and say, hey, Georgia, Florida remains in Jacksonville, fair or not, there may not be a ton that Kirby Smart can do about that. Now, it may be a reasonable point of view to say, hey, they ought to give Kirby everything he wants because he's won all these championships. That may be a reasonable point of view, but what's actually playing out here is that while Kirby Smart has an incredible level of power and political capital because of the winning that he's been doing, that does not give him total autonomy to be able to do whatever he wants to. Let's see what else. Michael, I don't want your conversation to come through the glass here, so just I guess be careful about that. Barry Watkins says, "Why is Florida scared to play us here in Georgia?" Yeah, I don't know about that. Not quite so sure. Not quite so sure about that. But we may get a chance to see Florida at least here for 1 year coming up, and there still continues to be some dispute about when that when those 2 years of stadium renovations might be, and whether or not the games will actually be home and home for those 2 years. Different people saying different things about that, but maybe 25, 26. Maybe in one of those 2 years you get a chance to see Georgia, Florida in Athens at some point in time. Ryan Walker, good to see Ryan in the comment section here today. Says Carson Beck could literally be a future first-round pick if he lights it up. Yeah, I think you're right about that, Ryan. I do. I do. Ken Holcomb says there was a troll in the Facebook thing earlier. Ken, I'm sorry about that. I did not see that. We'll see if we can go back and find that. Chris James says Bobo will allow the offense to be more explosive and open the playbook for a wild dog with 2 tight ends. Yeah, I mean, I think that what you may see with Bobo there could be pretty fun. I think that could be pretty fun. I think there's a chance that Mike Bobo is a very, very a very, very effective offensive coordinator for Georgia. I'm actually pretty excited about him. And, once again, Kent, sorry about the trollish behavior earlier. We'll see if we can go back and find that. I was laughing at what somebody else said in the comment section here, too. But we'll go see if we can find that, Kent. I'm sorry about that. Gary Holt says the Georgia NIL is full swing more than ever. Yeah, I mean, I think that, a lot of people, I think, had a little bit of a misbegotten notion about NIL based on some of the things that Kirby Smart said in the past. I mean, I don't get the impression that Georgia is playing the NIL game at a lower level than anybody else is. What I've said about NIL is I think there are a lot of misperceptions about it. I think NIL is a little bit more present in every story than some people realize. But maybe like the most extreme sort of exaggerated examples are probably more fake than people realize. So you can sort of point to this and say, well, that's just dumb. But that doesn't mean that NIL doesn't sort of exist just below the surface on almost every story. In other words, the average player may be getting more NIL than you realize, and the top players may be getting less NIL than you realize. But the name of the game, and I continue to believe that the media that's choosing to cover the NIL space, they are not covering this properly. They are not. There has got to be a lot more attention paid in the future to the NIL supply. Where is the money coming from? In any economy, you got supply and you got demand. And like for every, 1,000 stories you see about NIL demand, programs that wanted to pay players that seek the money, there is one story about the NIL supply. And the most undercovered story out there is the challenge that comes from raising money from an NIL standpoint. That is the thing that people are just not paying enough attention to. Is not who's effective at giving money out. I think a lot of this sort of functions a little bit like a tech startup or something like that. There's a pretty high churn rate, I believe, for a lot of these NIL collectives right now, where they're giving out money, but they're giving out money with the promise that there's more money along the way. I think the template for this is what Colorado said when they hired Deion Sanders. They admitted that the contract they hired Sanders to, the money they promised him they didn't currently have, but they said, we're not worried about it. We're going to find a way to raise it. I think there's a lot of, we're not worried about the money. We'll find a way to raise it going on NIL right now. And I think that at a certain point, we're going to have to start paying a lot more attention to how is NIL money being raised, because what you're seeing is a lot of collectives are having to sort of rethink what they thought their cap was going to be. You know, the amount of money they were going to have. They're having to rethink that a little bit because it's just not easy to raise money. It's just not easy. And anybody who's ever, raised money for a church or a political campaign or a high school booster club will tell you, it is hard to put big dollars together on the back of small donations. It just is. It just is. You got to have big donations to raise big bucks. And NIL collectives, I think, are having varying degrees of success of being able to do that. Zach Adams says rewind the show by about an hour. The good news is, Zach, if you go to YouTube, you can do that. You can't rewind Facebook, but I believe you can rewind YouTube. So if you want, not to say that I want you to leave Facebook because I'm platform agnostic, but if you wanted to go to YouTube, I believe you can rewind back to the beginning if you wanted to. While we're live. Facebook obviously kind of just sort of regenerates once it's over, but YouTube, I believe you can rewind right now. In fact, let me see if I can do this. Yeah, I can rewind on Facebook right now. I can rewind all the way back to the beginning. Georgia on tap telling stories in here. Georgia, you got to realize, you got to change the names to protect the innocent on something like that. Randy Payne checking in from Tifton, Georgia. Randy is a wild man. He was on our Dog Nation cruise. I love Randy. Back-to-back world champs. I like that, Randy, for sure. Glad to see you in here today. Let's see what else. Christy, very funny. Nature Gator says that Jeremiah Smith tweeted yesterday that he was, quote, just playing in response to the Ohio State fans concerned about his official visits to Florida and Georgia. And Nature, I don't mind telling you, for your team, for my team, there's obviously a chance that's true, right? Because even with Brian Hartline having a, pretty shaky offseason, the truth is that Hartline's as good a coach recruiting his position as anybody in the country is. So, I mean, obviously, I respect Hartline when it comes to these wide receivers, absolutely. So there is a very good chance that Jeremiah Smith just sort of keeps it where he's got it and remains in that Ohio State class. But, he's also been pretty open to chatting about, Florida, chatting about Georgia. As of late, I've been talking more about Georgia because of the Dylan Raiola, addition. So this is what you do. I think you just got to have you got to have thick skin when it comes to recruiting. You got to play the game, you got to fight the battle, and you got to see if you can win. And when it comes to Jeremiah Smith, maybe Georgia doesn't win, or maybe Florida doesn't win here. But that's how you play. You play full contact, you play full speed, and a lot of Ohio State fans don't like that. I'm telling you, the Big Ten folks are just sort of cut different. They're just sort of cut from a different kind of cloth. They don't like all this. Well, he's our commit. Why you host him on a visit? That's not the way the Big Ten folks. Urban Meyer changed some of that. He brought some of that SEC style recruiting to the Big Ten that didn't used to exist. But a lot of those Big Ten folks are still of the belief there's some sort of gentleman's agreement in place of, well, if he's our commit, you shouldn't be hosting him on a visit. That is not the way we play down here. That is not what we do. We throw elbows in recruiting, and Georgia fans, Florida fans, all kind of understand that, make peace with that. A lot of those Big Ten folks don't like that, and so they're giving Jeremiah Smith big time grief. And listen, I'll be honest with you. Nolan Smith did a little bit of this. Nolan Smith did a little bit of flirting with like Alabama and places like that. And when he was recruited, I didn't like it either. I didn't. So I don't mind telling you that, you don't always love it necessarily when you feel like somebody's kind of cultivating that attention. It's kind of funny now that Nolan's like on this sort of top shelf of like distinguished gentlemen I think have ever come through the Georgia program. As a recruit, I didn't always love some of that, type of stuff, but that's just the way it goes. Let's see what else. Let's see what else. DMart42 calls the wild dog a gimmick. I don't know in all situations that's all that gimmicky, right? Because the purpose of the wild dog is the extra blocker, right? I mean, that's what you really that's why you like wild dog, right? So I don't know in all situations that necessarily all that gimmicky. Because I get what you're saying. I don't love gimmicks. I don't love trick plays. I never really have. I think if you get the better players, just line up and run some regular plays. Now, was I jumping up and down when Kenny McIntosh threw a touchdown in the Orange Bowl. I guess figuratively speaking, I probably was. But generally speaking, I'm not in favor of trick plays. I don't know that I necessarily think of Wild Dog as kind of a gimmicky trick play type of thing. Christy says she needs an attorney. Oh, no, Christy, what you do now? Let's see what else. Greg Roseberg says, I say it's only 50-50 that Raiola stays long enough to become our starter, maybe less. Real good chance Puglisi becomes our quarterback. The coattails and recruiting really matters, though. Yeah, so we saw this with Justin Fields. Justin didn't stay around Georgia very long, but the players that came to Georgia because of Fields, they stay for their full career in many cases. Now, I think that two things are true. First of all, I think that it's got to be very, very appropriately appreciated what kind of prospect Raiola is. Y'all, the people who rank him number one overall, they're not doing this for giggles, right? I mean, there is a reason that he's ranked where he's ranked. This is a special prospect. And if you go on the basis of his rankings, he is a little bit different from a prospect standpoint than what Georgia has had at the position. So on the one hand, that's true. On the other hand, college football is not easy to predict. Things play out in college football a little bit differently than sometimes we could imagine. And there's plenty of examples, obviously most obvious, Stetson Bennett, that sort of cite that to be true. So I think that Raiola's talent has to be respected. And in any conversation about the future of the Georgia quarterback position, it's got to be acknowledged about what kind of skill set he brings with him. But I also think the mysterious nature of college football sort of has to be respected too, that Gunnar Stockton's not backing down from a fight here. Brock Vandagriff not going to back down from a fight here. The guys that Georgia has moving forward, Ryan Puglisi too, who I think has already said a couple of times that he's not backing down on the basis of the Raiola news here, that there are a lot of guys who are going to just sort of wait for their chance and fight for their opportunity. And that's kind of what's happening at Georgia here right now, even before Raiola gets here. Dan Judson says, could a tight end win the Heisman? Dan, I believe that could be the case. First of all, I believe that Bowers is that good. I think when you compare how he's viewed now compared to when he was a freshman, because he was having an amazing freshman season, and I swear nobody even knew who he was. The Dadgum Mackey Award didn't even have him as like a finalist. And he had 14 touchdowns or something like that year. So clearly he's kind of gotten over the hump of folks knowing who he is. He's commonly mock draft right now in the top, if you can use mock draft as a verb. He's mock drafted right now around that sort of top 10 range. So he's going to enter the season pretty famous. And here's the thing that I think that Brock Sena got going for him. Is a couple of years ago we saw a wide receiver win the Heisman Trophy. That's also the kind of thing that didn't used to happen. That was a pandemic year, and that's kind of weird. But nonetheless, a Heisman Trophy winner was a wide receiver, something that did not used to occur. Aiden Hutchinson is kind of an edge rusher type, was a Heisman finalist in 2021. That's another thing that kind of didn't used to occur. Jordan Davis, partially because of us, but nonetheless, Jordan Davis got some Heisman buzz in 2021. That's the kind of thing that would not have occurred in previous years. So I believe the door is open for an unorthodox Heisman winner now in a way that probably was not true 3, 4, 5 years ago. There's just a little bit more of a chance for that now. So if I was going to bet a Georgia player to win the Heisman, given the odds you could probably find it at, I would think that Bauer's probably the best overall bet there. George on Tap says he uses the YouTube show for when his wife comes in, wants to talk, and then he can backtrack on what he missed. So, yeah, there you go. There you go. Let's see what else. Paul Moon says, I'd prefer we just not put our number one overall quarterback in the portal 2 days after he commits and before he even starts his senior year of high school. Yeah, and to Paul's point here, like, my wish for all Georgia fans is just be content to let it play out. Like be happy being happy. And I mean that for everybody across the board. Just be content to wait and see, because I promise you that's what Kirby Smart is. He's content to wait and see. Let me go to DawgNation.com for a moment. Thor Rules checking in, having some fun at the expense of Ohio State fans, which we love. Dave Snow letting us know that, how about this? Brenton Cox, an undrafted free agent of the Green Bay Packers. Boy, how the mighty have fallen there on that. Pretty wild. Hunker Down 93, also the subject of Lynette Whitehead, the transfer running back. So, yeah, I think that you're probably looking at a guy that's probably here more as a replacement for what Georgia lost in Savon Clark right now, more so than some sort of insurance policy against a future Kendall Milton injury or a more sustained Branson Robinson injury, something like that. I think we're talking about here a situation where Whitehead is sort of more here to kind of bolster the Georgia running back depth on the back end as opposed to the front end. That doesn't mean he's not a good player. This is a former 4-star prospect coming out of high school. He went to Athens Academy and obviously good enough to be in the SEC there at Tennessee. He's dealt with some injuries, but this is a strong dude. So, I think one of the things that Georgia wants to be able to do, it wants to be able to have good practices, and it takes a lot of players to have good practices. Like, one of the things that we don't think about, is when your roster is thin. There are some teams, and, pre-Kirby Smart, sometimes this was true of Georgia, you may have 70-something players on your team. Well, the biggest problem when you have a small number of players, when you don't have the full 85-man roster, or when you don't have a good complement of walk-ons to go along with that, all of a sudden you don't have as many players to rep during practice, and that gets really hard. You just want more. You just want more practice reps. You want you want to be able to have good looks during practice, and so at the very least, Whitehead becomes a guy that's able to provide some of that for you. And who knows? You bide your time, you wait for your moment, and you get a chance to showcase what you're all about there. So this to me is a depth move. It's about the back end of the running back rotation, I believe, more so than the front end of the rotation. And it's also maybe a little bit of a signal to Georgia fans of how worried should you be about injuries to running backs. Well, apparently Kirby Smart and Del McGee aren't all that worried about it, because instead of going out and getting somebody who's been starting for another SEC team or another college football team, you go out and get a guy like Whitehead, which kind of gives you an idea of the degree to which that Georgia's concerned about its running back situation right now. So it's a good question, and that's, I think, probably the best answer to it. Let us see what else. Thor Rule says, how about the top receivers who may flip or sign with Georgia because of the Dylan Raiola signing? Well, we talked about Jeremiah Smith a little earlier. That's the biggest name because I believe that Jeremiah Smith's the best wide receiver in the country. But then in addition to that, you start talking about Ryan Wingo, who I think that Georgia's had a pretty good relationship with for a while, and probably some of that's because a lot of these guys knew that Raiola was coming to Georgia anyway. Now, the big mystery to me is, and this is one of the things I'm sort of curious to hear from Jeff Sentell, and honestly, the answer may not end up being good news, but this is what I'm curious of, is a guy like Mike Matthews, who Georgia seemingly hasn't been a factor with at all. Does Matthews consider Georgia now more because of Dylan Raiola? That's the one for me. And, once again, if I have a bias, I'll give it to you. Matthews is a guy I'm sort of biased in favor of because he's here in the metro Atlanta area. This is a guy I've seen play in high school. I'll tell you right now, I believe that Mike may be most exciting player in the state here this year. Juju Lewis, obviously, as a sophomore, is going to make a push for that himself. But I believe Mike Matthews may be the most exciting player in the state. And I'd love to see that guy go to Georgia. I just really, really would. And there is just zero chatter about that. That dog is not barking right now. So does Raiola change that with a guy like Mike Matthews? I guess that'd be one of the big names I'd be interested to see. Randy also pointing out that Lyneth Whitehead could be a missile on special teams. An absolute missile. And you may be right about that, Randy. Randy also pointing out that Eli Ricks, undrafted free agent, went to the Eagles. Yeah, low key, in addition to all the Georgia players, Eagles have a little bit of a thing for the Alabama guys too. They just like good players from good teams, and has been pointed out in the past. The Raiders tried this a couple of years ago with Clemson players, didn't quite work out. But maybe that's what you get for hitching your wagon to the ACC. All right, let's do one kind of trip around the comment section here just for a moment. Let us see what else. Taylor Russell says that Mr. Matthews had a great tutelage from his high school principal, Mr. Feeney. So there you go on that. Frank Patterson says, which dog is more slept on, Cash Jones or Dan Jackson? Yeah, I don't know about that. That's an interesting comparison, Frank. Obviously, hoping to see Dan Jackson back healthy again, contributing to that secondary. And Cash Jones is one of those guys that, he catches the ball pretty well out of the backfield. You kind of wonder if that could become a weapon there a little bit. Jay Buchanan says, what's your confidence level in Kirby with a shiny new 5-star quarterback? I have a ton of friends who point out the Justin Fields story as a reason for concern, but I don't fall into it. What's your take? So go back to Justin Fields here for a moment. So the Elite 11 quarterback guru at that time was Trent Dilfer. Now, Dilfer's the UAB coach now. Had been in high school for a while. Of course, won the Super Bowl as the quarterback for the Baltimore Ravens. But his sort of job that kind of got him into coaching was running the Elite 11. So Dilfer knew those Elite 11 quarterbacks very, very well. A couple of years ago, we interviewed Dilfer at the Super Bowl. This is shortly after the Fields thing came to an end. And I asked Dilfer, who knew Justin very well, what his take on that was. And Dilfer said on DawgNation, we played this clip a million times before, Dilfer said on DawgNation that he told Justin, you're a fool if you go to Georgia. Do not go to Georgia. They've got their quarterback. It's Jake Fromm. He emerged there as a freshman starter. They're not going to move off Jake Fromm. And by the way, Dilfer, I think, knows Jake pretty well too. Dilfer told that to Fields directly, and Fields just didn't listen. So if you can say, well, Georgia takes some blame for the Justin Fields situation kind of fizzling out, then I think you have to say that Justin Fields has to take some blame for that too. Somebody somewhere had the wrong level of expectation here. Maybe Georgia was wrong in expecting Justin to be a little bit more patient. Maybe Justin was wrong for expecting to have his impatience rewarded, because what we know is, Zach Klein had this video. South Carolina game was week 2 of the 2018 season, and Justin Fields was walking off the field. He was pouting and he was mad because he didn't get to play more, and when he did play, all he did was hand it off and all, this, that, and, whatever else. That Justin was already unhappy at Georgia by week 2. We have video evidence to prove that, which only kind of backs up what Trent Dilfer said. Is if you go to Georgia, you are doomed to be unhappy because they've got their starting quarterback. And so Fields has to kind of carry part of that blame there as well. But let's say that Justin had chosen to be more patient here. Who's to say how all that would have played out, right? I mean, I think one of the mistakes that sometimes people make a little bit is that somehow quarterback situations are static, that once a guy pulls ahead, he just sort of remains ahead forever. Had Fields and Fromm both chosen to stay here over the course of the long haul, they probably would have continued to compete back and forth over the course of the long haul there as well. But that's not what Justin wanted. So ultimately, if Georgia saw a chance to go out and get the, one of the 2 best prospects in the country that year, and they took a swing at it. It didn't quite work, but also it didn't end up being all that devastating, for Georgia. They ended up winning 2 national championships anyway. And, I'm not sugarcoating over, over the loss of Justin Fields. It was kind of frustrating at the time because a lot of us, once again, Atlanta area folks, we wanted to see Justin do well here at Georgia because of kind of what he represented as an elite prospect from the Atlanta area. We wanted to see that. But ultimately, I don't know that Georgia's got a lot of egg on its face for the Justin Fields situation, and I say this as candidly as I can. It took a shot at Justin. It brought him in. Didn't quite work out. But it's not like Justin went to Ohio State and won a stack of national championships. He obviously didn't do that. He was a good player, and he is a good player. I think he's a very interesting quarterback for the Chicago Bears, if nothing else. I actually root for Justin pretty good. I wish he would have come to Atlanta. So I like Justin as a player. I root for Justin as a player. But it's not like Georgia wears some sort of embarrassment over the Fields situation. Georgia has done better post-Fields than Fields has done post-Georgia. And I believe that's kind of the thing. Let's see what else. Greg Rosenberg brings up a really good point. And this is an issue that has got to be, I think, figured out moving forward. He says, I know some big-time McGill Club big donors. He says they don't want to give to the collective. It's not tax deductible, and there aren't as many good perks. So, Greg, what I'd be interested in knowing is, now my wife is a CPA, so she knows more about taxes than I do. The donations to, like, the athletic department in general are nowhere near as tax deductible as they used to be, right? Like, a lot of people used to get big-time tax breaks on even buying their tickets. And that's not true anymore, I don't believe. Now, listen, I am not an expert on that. Don't pretend to be. But I think the tax breaks you get for giving to the university have actually gone down pretty significantly in recent years, I believe. But your point about the collective is a significant one. And I am not saying give to this, don't give to that. I think you should make your own choice about that. But if you join the McGill Society, I think they were giving you, and I think this is probably still true, basically 1.5, points for every dollar you gave. So if you join McGill, you were climbing the ranks of status in terms of being able to get tickets and things like that. So if you wanted college football playoff tickets, if you want Georgia Florida tickets, if you want national championship tickets, you don't get a whole lot of value for the home games because a lot of the home games are, the best tickets are occupied by people who've had those seats for 50 years. But away games, the travel games, playoff games, things like that, the McGill people are just shooting up the ranks because they're giving, I think it's 1.5 for every dollar, I think. Once again, I may have like 40% of this right, but it's something along those lines where there's a huge incentive from a ticket buying standpoint to be in McGill. In addition to that, they get a chance to attend practices. They get a chance to have those like post-signing day cocktail parties with Georgia coaches. And listen, I've known people who've been there, and they just sort of post up and just sit there and have a cocktail and talk to like the Georgia coaches. And the coaches get loose-lipped, man. They're talking like this is not press conference version of so-and-so coach. This is 2 beers in version of so-and-so coach. And all of a sudden now you're getting some stuff you don't always get. So there is and plus they have parties, things like that. There is a lot of incentive for being in McGill. Thus far, I haven't heard that same kind of incentivization for the NIL stuff. And so it is a big decision where I think a lot of athletic departments are trying to say, hey, the best way you can support us right now is to give to the NIL collective. But rightly, if you're in McGill, you're probably a fairly high net worth type person, or at least a high salary type person. I think rightly that person's going to ask, well, what do I get for my money? I get all this stuff for giving, to McGill and these various capital campaigns, things like that. What do I get for giving to this NIL stuff? And I think the answer to that's not quite so clear. And the point that Greg's bringing up, it's got to be addressed of how do you make NIL more sustainable? How do you make the people who are giving to it glad they gave to it? Because rich people are not going to decrease their net worth for the sake of their college football team. They're just not. Not for a long period of time. They're just not. All right, let's get a few more comments. Daddy's Channel says Chaney's scheme didn't fit Justin and the Monken. He says the Monken system would have done well for Justin Fields. Maybe that's the case. I mean, I'll tell you this, though. Chaney's last year at Georgia, I know a lot of Georgia fans don't necessarily like to hear this. I thought that the Georgia offense 2018 was actually pretty good. They were humming along pretty good. So, I don't have much beef with Jim Chaney in 2018 for the offense that he was running. Christy says that Fields was so much fun to watch in high school. Really was. I think that, Trevor Lawrence rightly was the number one player in the country. There's that thing where, 24/7 had Lawrence number one, kind of briefly moved Fields to number one, then moved Lawrence back to number one again. I think that Lawrence is the right number one player in the country for that 2018 class. But Justin Fields was really fun to watch. Really was fun to watch. Now, here's what's going to be interesting. Does Dylan Raiola remain the number one overall recruit in the 2024 class now that he's committed? Because, we saw this a year ago that once Arch Manning committed, of the major recruiting services, some of them did not keep Arch at number one, right? I think 24/7 may have, but some of the other services did not keep Arch at number one. Am I right about this? It'll be interesting to see that, a lot of these, and listen, I love the people who do this for a living because I like reading recruiting rankings, things like that, but recruiting rankings are a business. And, sometimes it's good business to rank somebody else number one once, somebody else is committed. And so I think it'll be interesting to see does Raiola remain number one overall recruit now that he's committed, because sometimes that's not quite the way it goes. Alan Hampton says NIL in its current form isn't sustainable in my opinion. I think it's not. The word that you sometimes see people use, I saw, what's his name from On3, Shannon Terry, who runs it, is very big in the NIL, kind of space right now. And he talks about the market becoming a little bit more efficient. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. And the way of saying that is that I think recruits are realizing there is a certain sort of cap on how much you're going to be able to get. And some transfers sort of seeing this too of, hey, these wild dollar figures being thrown around, but here's the real truth. You're likely to get, boom, this amount of money. And for certain players, that's more money than you probably realize. For other players, it's probably less money than you probably realize. But we're sort of seeing that the collective that thought it might be managing $8 million a year is downgrading the amount of money that it's actually going to be able to manage, which means there's just sort of less money to go around for recruits, and then programs sort of have to decide, or whatever the, whoever's going to have to decide, well, how is all that money allocated? Frederick Meredith calls his shot. Georgia win 10 of the next 20 national championships. Boy, that'd be fun. That'd be fun. I love that, Frederick. That's awesome. Daddy's channel says that that Raiola's going to get the Georgia bump. Maybe that's the case. Crow King 123 also points out that most of the great quarterbacks are already committed, so therefore they may not be anybody to slide into that spot. You could be right about that. And I certainly wasn't predicting that Raiola wouldn't remain number one, but this is just one of those things you sort of watch. It just sort of seems like, listen, I like the recruiting, sites. I don't have beef with them. I don't have beef with anybody. My life's great. But it does just sort of seem like as we get later into the year, being an uncommitted prospect does wonders for your recruiting ranking. You can't help but notice that. And I don't have a bad word to say about anybody who does any of that kind of stuff, but you can't help but notice. Let's see what else. Mark Woodmansee says, I met Trey Scott on the plane in New Orleans. He says Big Baby Jordan Hall is on point, ready to rock and roll. Hey, that's all I need to know right there, Mark. Thanks for the intel there on that. Not surprised to hear that. Trey Scott's got it pretty good these days. He's making a good bit of money. Got a great crop of young defensive linemen. I would say that Trey Scott is a happy dude right now and should be, and I'm glad to hear that. Let me go around the other comment section. Let me be back to Facebook here for a moment, see what they're doing over there. Jeff Ingram says, what happened to Ryan Puglisi? Hey, Puglisi's still locked in or ready to go. No issue with him whatsoever, I don't believe. He's said very much the same effect. He told Jeff that. I mean, look, these guys knew that Raiola was coming. I mean, Puglisi's had to know that for a while, and I don't think it's changed him. I don't think it's changed him whatsoever. Gary Holt says, "What do you spend on a Georgia home game for everything total cost?" Does that mean like an individual fan going, or what it costs Georgia to host a home game? Because one of the things, Gary, I've learned about this Georgia-Florida stuff is it's pretty expensive to host a Georgia home game, which I guess I should have probably known that already. I just don't think that much about it. I just sort of show up and everything happens. But it's pretty expensive to host a home game. But as far as what the average person spends, that would be interesting to see. I remember there used to always be these like economic studies that came out about how much it costs to go to a Major League Baseball game. And I used to always think those were so dumb because like the stuff they considered the cost of going to a game would be like 4 tickets, all these concessions, 2 souvenirs, and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, when I was younger, pre-kids, I was like, this is a dumb thing to even just a sort of a dumb measuring stick because you don't have to buy souvenirs. You don't have to buy all these concessions. Just go to the game. Well, now I got kids. And when you go to a Braves game, my son especially, love to go to a Braves game. But to him, going to a Braves game means going to the concession stand every 3 innings, getting a chance to pick out a souvenir at the end of the game. And all of a sudden, okay, now I see why they sort of rate the cost of going to a game as all these different things. You play games out there in the little kids area, and you take kids to a sporting event, it gets expensive because that concession stand just calls their name the entire time. Oh, it just calls their name. They just want to be in that concession stand so bad. And my son loves sports. He wants to watch the game. It's not like he wants to, leave his seat. He just wants to have a big plate of food in front of him while he's watching it. That's just the way it comes down. Kaylee Manziel, who's here today, is shaking her head about that. So some of us as adults understand that feeling too. But the point is that so I would say that, for some of us pre-kids going to a Georgia game, you buy the ticket, you bring a handful of, whatever with you, refreshments, and you're just good to go. Well, now, the cost of going to a Georgia game gets much, much more expensive when you think about buying tickets for kids. My daughter, who didn't even hardly watch the game, and all the food you got to buy to go along with that. Let's see what else. Let me read this from Adrian Carver, who says, last year, in addition to our annual trek to the cocktail party, hubby and I traveled to Kentucky and South Carolina. We've already made reservations for Nashville. What other away games this year would y'all suggest we hit? Well, the biggest game is going to be the one at Tennessee. Or at least we think that's going to probably be the biggest. And that's obviously a little bit of a mess. But if you really want like a intense game atmosphere. That's probably that. The good thing about going to Auburn is it's the easiest game to get to. Literally, from where I'm sitting right now in our DawgNation World Headquarters studios, I could drive to Auburn almost as quickly as I could drive to Athens. And so if you haven't been to the Auburn thing before, Auburn almost doesn't even count as a road game because it is just so close. Now, this is not a road game for Georgia this year, but the one thing I will tell you is, and I've mentioned this in our cool down before, this past year I went to Missouri for the first time. Y'all, it's hard to get there because it's, 2 million miles from here. Going to Columbia, Missouri was not a bad trip. And I've said this before. We stayed in St. Louis, went to a Cardinals game that Friday night, made about a 2-hour drive to Columbia the next day. Columbia's a pretty good restaurant town. There's some good food there, which is important for me. The game was obviously a total disaster, but the trip itself was actually pretty fun. So it just so happens that, moving forward, Georgia's not going to be going to Columbia every other year. But for those of you who are like Adrian, you kind of like that road trip every year, I would not discount Missouri as a halfway decent road trip to take if you're a Georgia fan. Just kind of file that away and keep that in mind. But for me, though, if you're already going to Nashville, and the Nashville thing is about Nashville more so than the game itself, there'll be 30,000 Georgia fans probably at that Vanderbilt game because they all like Broadway and stuff like that. But you want the big game, you go to Knoxville in November. Just make sure you bring a coat with you because it's going to probably be very cold. But you want sort of the ease of travel. You can be at Auburn in a hop, skip, and a jump. Let us see what else. Garrison Soul says Auburn could very well be undefeated when they face us. Yeah, Garrison, we've talked about this before. You bring up a good point. So you look at the Auburn September schedule. They have a weird road game at Cal, which is just bizarre. I can't imagine going to Berkeley to play a game, but that's what Auburn's going to do. Other than that, it's all like very easy directional school type stuff. And then September 23rd, the week before hosting Georgia, Auburn's on the road at Texas A&M. Auburn will almost certainly be a point spread underdog that day. But that's a game that Auburn could win. We've highlighted this a couple times. That is one of those games that does not involve Georgia that Georgia fans ought to be paying fairly close attention to. Because if Auburn does pull that upset on the road at Texas A&M, they come back home as a 4-0 team, I believe they would be, hosting Georgia on September 30th. Jordan-Hare Stadium will have a little bit of juice to it. If Peyton Thorne's kind of gotten off the schneid as a pretty good quarterback, if the receiver from Ohio State's playing okay, Auburn could have a little juice for that September 30th game if they find a way to beat Texas A&M. Pretty big game, not involving Georgia. All right, final comments. Cretaceous Williams says, if only the Falcons could channel some of this UGA success, I could die a happy sports fan. Yeah, we'll see about that for the Falcons here this year. Very good point. Daddy's Channel says Kirby's constructed an excellent machine from demanding the best, and he's created an atmosphere of excellence I think that is unrivaled. Just listen to the recruits talk about what they see here. No doubt about that. Mark Woodmansee says in Nashville, stay at the Marriott as it has a direct view of the field there at Vanderbilt. So there you go on that. That's a good tip. Good tip there as well. I'd be interested to know how many Georgia fans go to Nashville for the Georgia Vanderbilt game and don't actually make their way to the game. Maybe they start off with it. They got tickets in hand, but somehow they don't quite make their way over there. Broadway becomes a pretty formidable foe for some there that particular weekend. Alan Hampton says in the early 70s, it was so much fun for 2 or 3 buddies to jump in the car. Game day morning, put a sign in the window that said need tickets. We would always get pulled over between Atlanta and Athens. That's an awesome thing to think about. I sort of missed the days of paper tickets for that particular reason. I feel like it was way easier to kind of acquire tickets back when they were paper tickets. And I guess sometimes you get the counterfeit stuff. But to me, way easier back then in the paper ticket days, I believe. William Phillips says, do you think Alabama wins the West? William, that's a great question. I believe today my pick would be LSU to win it again. I think that's what I would say. Jay Buchanan says, I'm from Franklin, just south of Nashville. By the way, Franklin, Tennessee, one of the great suburbs in America. Franklin, the suburb of Nashville there, one of the truly great suburbs in America. He says, I haven't missed a UGA Vandy game since 1994. There you go. Must be a lot of fun to have the Dogs coming into town there, and I'm sure you must get hit up for all kinds of stuff from your fellow Georgia fans who want the lay of the land there in Nashville. Cretaceous says the day the Falcons host that Lombardi might be the happiest day of my life. Maybe one of these days we'll get a chance to see that. All right, anything else before we get ready to go? Anything else? Greg Perlago says, I went to I think he's talking about the 2019 game. Entire stadium was red and black. Y'all, I'm telling you right now, everybody says, Georgia took over the stadium. I swear to you, it was hard to find Vanderbilt fans that day. Like the way that we were sitting in the press box, they have a very odd press box configuration at Vanderbilt. But the way we were sitting in the press box, all I could see were Georgia fans. It was almost like a high school game where like the entire side of the field, the only side of the field I could really see, the entire side of the field was nothing but Georgia fans. It's a stadium that probably holds, 40,000 people. Literally, it was basically full with almost nothing but Georgia fans. It was wild. Season opener in 2019. Crazy. Thor Rules asked a good question. Why the other UGA sports have been subpar. I don't know that I got a great answer to that. But obviously, because the SEC network and things like that, there's more attention being paid to some of the other sports. And there's obviously a wish to see Georgia be more competitive on a regular basis in sports like baseball and basketball, things like that. Obviously, best of luck to the UGA softball team this weekend, hosting an NCAA regional. But, seeing Georgia be a little bit more of a fixture. And the entire time we've done DawgNation Daily, which goes back to 2015, I don't think we've had a really long NCAA tournament run for any of what I sort of think of as the traditional sports, like track and field and tennis, things like that. I just don't follow those sports very closely. I don't know a lot about those. I'm not against them. I just don't know a lot about them. But when you sort of think of as sort of like stick and balls type sports, I don't think we've had a deep run for a non-football team the entire time we've been doing this. Like Georgia made the NCAA regional in baseball a couple of years ago and got knocked out. Now, the 2020 Georgia baseball team could have won it all. They had the kind of pitching, that they had the sort of success, just sort of a hard luck thing. The season that got taken away, Georgia would have been very good that year and had that sort of taken from it. We'll see what the softball team's able to do. Lady Dogs have made the tournament a couple of times. But we haven't really had that big run for another team the entire time we've been doing all this. Celicia Gagnon, thanks for the kind words. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Let's see what else. Why am I making Lucy nervous? All right. Oh, maybe about the Auburn game, maybe. And Miriam's right. She mentioned the idea of collecting those paper tickets. Yeah, I mean, I've got just boxes and boxes of every sporting event I've ever been to. I just love collecting stuff like that. I'm kind of a lot of sports fans are collectors. I'm definitely a collector. And, this is sort of day and age of digitalization. It's just like there's just less to collect. Speaking of which, I saw this thing the other day where famous celebrity was walking out of a sporting event. Everybody's handing their phone. He's doing a selfie and giving it back. Is that the new autograph now? You kind of do the selfie for somebody and give it back. I thought that was kind of wild to see. Anyway, that's a different topic for a different day. We have got to go for now. Y'all have a great day. Check out the AJC online, ajc.com. Braves lost last night to the Texas Rangers. You can read more about that. Had the young guy up pitching, and, that went about the way you think it might go. So that's that. Also, how about this? Guns N' Roses is going to play Music Midtown. Kaylee's excited about that. So you can read more about the lineup for Music Midtown online, ajc.com there as well. All of that online for you. And what's the future of Michael Soroka? Braves pitcher, been rehabbing down in minor leagues. Doesn't sound like his call-up's coming anytime soon. So find out more about that online, ajc.com. Also, check out our friends at R.S. Andrews. They bring the R.S. Andrews cool down to us each and every day. You can find them online, rsandrews.com. Most importantly, this time of year, think about getting that air conditioning unit tuned back up to factory fresh specs. R.S. Andrews is just great at doing that for you. They'll keep you cool and comfortable all summer long because it's going to be a hot one. It's already hot. And you may have an old unit and somebody's told you need to replace it, but R.S. Andrews may be able to tell you how you can get some new life out of that old unit, and it may only cost you $99 to do so. So find them online at rsandrews.com. We'll see you back here tomorrow. R.S. Andrews Cool Down when it's all said and done. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management before that. We'll talk to you then, everybody.